east, but the real attack was the Islam. Okay, that was the main one from the south. And the Vikings, people don't even understand that a lot of the Viking raids, especially for slaves, okay, white slaves, was to feed the Arab slave emporium because there was such a demand for white slaves.
So they were selling, Vikings were
Yeah,
selling
they would
slaves
go to
the-
Ireland and England and France and wherever and conquer. And all those slaves, most of them would be sold down through the rivers of Russia to the caliphates, the Abbasids, for example, the Abbasid Caliphate. That used to be a well-known thing. And we know this as well because a lot of the treasure troves of Viking coins that are found in Scandinavia are Arab coins. So what commodity do Vikings have to give? Slaves. And we
Wow.
also have records for it. So, the whole point is Islam has had a profound impact on the shaping of Europe. And there's historians, I quote one in one of my books, something Cardini, where he basically says Islam was a midwife to Europe. It created Europe. And the reason Europe became martial and you had the night culture and everything and a very staunch Christian kind of defensive posture was because of Islam. It was surrounding it. And they knew what happened. They understood that 3/4 of Christendom was destroyed and conquered and Islamized. So
Wow.
we haven't even reached the Crusades. Okay. And look what Islam had done. And I'm here to tell you, because I've looked at this and parents write to me about school books, textbooks, and social science books. What I just described to you doesn't even get any mention. You just get one sentence about how Islam spread through trade in the Middle East, and they won't tell you the Middle East was so Christian before that. They always like to act like Europe was Christian and everything else wasn't. No, Europe was the leftover portion of Christendom that never got conquered. Portions of it did, Spain and the Balkans later under the Ottomans, and we'll get into that. But yeah, so this is, I'll stop
So
right
why do
there.
you think that they were so successful in so quickly conquering so much?
Yeah, there's a lot of theories about that. Um, the one which I touched on is, the Roman Empire and the Persians were at war right before the Islamic conquest, literally like a decade or two. They were constantly bleeding each other. So one theory is that they were both so exhausted that when this new power rose up in Arabia, they were able to just conquer them piecemeal. So that's one. The Muslim theory is God's on our side, and this is proof, and this is why we won. The contemporary Christian theory, this is how people always thought. They thought we were sinners. And so, God had raised Amalek against us, or whatever the Old Testament analogy is. He's raised some kind of pagan people to attack the believers, the Hebrews, and punish them and chastise them for their evil ways. So that comes out regularly amongst the Christian.
Do you think that there's anything in the culture of Christianity that?
Yeah, well, that's the Edward Gibbon argument, okay, which is basically that, because of Christianity, it sort of emasculated the martial ethos of the Roman Empire, and it made them sitting ducks, for the Arabs. That's also I don't know how accurate that is, because you still find very martial Christians during this time. So Charlemagne is now the year 800. We have the rise of Charlemagne.
Wait, before we get to Charlemagne, though, so the Muslim armies they don't conquer Tours, and they're fought back, right? And I think all the way back to Spain. Correct me if I get any of this history wrong.
Yeah, no, right.
So what galvanizes them, the Europeans, to fight back, and why is it that they don't go past into, at that point, presumably it's called Al-Andalus, right? So
that's what the Arabs call it. Yeah.
What would the Europeans have called that region?
To them, it was, it's known sometimes as Iberia, but it's the Spains, because it was various Spanish kingdoms before it became one. Hispania, that was, I think, its Latin term.
So there was at least by the time they got to Tours, which is a long way far into Europe, there was a sort of galvanizing of Christians. Yeah. Christian armies, and there was a military response.
Right. So in Spain, you had the Visigoths, okay, and Al-Andalus is actually because the Arabs, they somehow confused the Visigoths with the Vandals. Al-Andalus, Vandals, okay, so that's, I think, the origin of the etymology of that, why they call it that, yeah, because the Vandals were in North Africa also a little before that time, and they conflate them all together, Vandals, Visigoth. They fought back, the Visigoths, and they lost. I mean, they were, and again, these are very sketchy sources. We just have one or two chronicles that are vague, but we know they fought back and there were major battles, but they lost. and they got Islamized. And but then a very small a very small group of Christians, according to both Muslim, and it's a very interesting story. Led by a man named Paleo or Pelagius, and he was the one who supposedly initiated the Reconquista. So they fled into the rocky, barren regions of the northwestern quadrant of the Spanish peninsula, and they lived in caves, just a small group of Christians. Okay, and the rest of the Christians became dhimmis, or subjects of the Islamic State, paying tribute and being essentially second-class citizens. And but from that small hole in the northwest quadrant is where the Reconquista begins, and it comes down slowly southwards.
So that's almost immediately after.
Yeah.
Okay.
According to the
And then you've got sort of 800 years of battles between them
until 1492, basically, and still Muslims are there even after 1492. But so basically, from 711, we're talking like over 700 years, almost eight. And it's to me, Spain is a microcosm of the sort of Christian Muslim wars, because it's all just concentrated in one little nation. And all the things that we know that we can talk about these conflicts manifest themselves in stark display in Spain. Okay, because you have the Christians versus the Muslims. The Muslims are in the south, the Christians are in the north. They're in constant warfare.
So they're not actually living amongst each other. They push to different regions.
Well, so the Free Christians of the north, that were a small group, they started pushing south, and they were independent, and they were the enemies of the Muslims. A lot of Christians during the conquest did live in the south with the Muslims as second-class dhimmis, subjects, okay? And every time, it was, as usual, when the Muslims and the Christians were fighting, the Muslims of the south versus the Free Christians of the north, the Muslims would take it out on their own Christians as a sort of collective punishment, and
right.
Yeah, that comes out a lot. And while we're at it, because someone's going to say, well, what about the great Andalusia? And this is where, this is where Jews and Christians and Muslims prospered and they loved each other. This is one of the themes that is, or apology, as that often comes out. And all I have to say to that, well, the easy answer, anyone who really wants to delve into this question, they should read the professor. He's a friend of mine, Dario Fernandez Morera. He wrote a book called The Andalusian Myth, a whole book, okay, just tearing into this idea. But just to give you one example, at the height of this golden age, you have what's called the martyrs of Cordoba, which is something like 50, 60 Christians who get boiled, skinned alive, impaled, beheaded, because they blasphemed against Muhammad. Okay. So this is like, they finally, they found what they want to claim is this great time of tolerance and beauty. And yeah, but they're acting like ISIS on steroids. Okay. But we don't talk about that. So my point is just to show you that even when they try to find something, if you really look into it, no, it's the same as usual. What they're really boasting about is it was so wealthy. So Andalusia was wealthy, and people will talk about, oh, look at the backwards Europes. They were, whatever, poor, and look at this grand civilization, Andalusia. What they don't tell you is most of that wealth was because the Muslims were plundering it from the Europeans, including selling them on the slave market and plundering them, essentially. And that has always traditionally been Islam's capital, other people's stuff.
Were they converting Europeans to Islam?
Yeah. So when they conquered Spain, for example, I'm sure a lot of native Spaniards, Christians, converted.
Okay. And was it, did they bring sort of civilization with them from
Well, so
Africa,
that's the question.
Was it a sort of military nation of a kind of a band of
warrior aristocracy?
Warrior aristocracy. Yeah.
That's definitely how it was initially. And so when you look, sometimes they'll tell you, well, yeah, but the Islamic world was so advanced when Europe was in the Dark Ages. Okay, so what they don't tell you is, one, this is still an early time, so that a lot of the people who were inventing things or doing something important, Averroes, the philosopher, or whatever, a lot of these guys were either Christians or Jews, or even more often they had recently converted. So this important person or whatever just became a Muslim recently, or he was the son of a man who converted. So a lot of times, whatever credit is being allotted to Islam was really by Jews and Christians of the old civilizations doing what they've always been doing. Okay, but sort of Islam gets the credit. But where Islam really takes over, and then it really spreads and everyone becomes Muslim, you see the opposite. Okay, in Spain, to go back to that, the Muslims were obligated, especially when the Christians of the north were still weak, to wage two jihads every year, and it was always devastating. And they came back with the heads of, they would decapitate, make
They were
pyramids.
obligated to
They were
wage by
obligated
who?
by Islamic law. The Caliph said twice a year. And there are Islamic teachings in the Sharia of you have to, when you can, you have to launch raids on the infidel. You can't live in peace with them as long as you can. Obviously, if you're weak, you shouldn't. Um, so, and very graphic to the point that until now, there are portions of Spain, especially the middle zone where the frontier, that are completely destroyed, and they still can't bring it back to life. It's just a complete war zone from all that. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's anyway. It's good we can kind of stop right here real quick, because now we're getting to near the Crusade time, and we haven't even gotten there. But just think it for a while. Like, all this is what happened before the First Crusade, right?
Yeah.
And when we talk about the First Crusade, you're going to find out the problem is people present it in a vacuum. They don't tell you what I just told you. And all of a sudden, it's just these crazy Catholics decided to go and go abuse the poor. A guy like John Esposito, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a professor from Georgetown, where I went. And there's a quote, which I quote so often that I think I've memorized it from him. And he says, 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence elapsed between Muslims and Christians until an imperial papal power play led to a series of so-called holy wars, which have left an enduring legacy of mistrust and resentment amongst Muslims. In other words, before the First Crusade, which was called in 1095, I haven't even gotten there. I've basically stopped around 800, right?
Yeah.
Before that, he's saying Muslims and Christians lived in perfect peace and harmony. Even though I just got done telling you that Muslims conquered 3/4 of the Islamic world, of the Christian world, through sheer violence and bloodshed. Okay. And that's what and the thing is, it's not just him. This is the official line amongst historians and academics. And I mentioned him because he was especially back in the day when I was going there, every military analysts and politicians would consult him about questions about Islam. And it's the same thing with people like Karen Armstrong. She's a best-selling author about religions. You read what she says. Again, she'll start off with the Crusades and just how evil it was, and act like everything before it was nothing but Muslims being good to Christians. Okay, so these are what we would call, omission,
Lies
crimes
by
of
omission.
omission. Yeah.
Right. But at that point, though, do we need to go back to Charlemagne to tie the bow on Charlemagne?
No, not really. I mean, he's great for his own thing, Charles the Great. I'll give you one quick anecdote again, because it shows you the games they play. So it's known that he and Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph, the Abbasid Caliph, had good relations. Okay. And people use this often as, see.
And where was that Caliph based?
Baghdad.
Okay.
The Abbasid Caliphate. And we're talking now, the year 800 or a little after. And people will always show you, see, it's, Islam and Christians got along. You got two emperors, or a caliph and an emperor, and they were friends, et cetera, et cetera. And they gave gifts to one each other. But when you dig in and you read the chronicles, and I quoted, I'm pretty sure in Sword and Scimitar, I discuss the chronicler of Charlemagne. He makes it perfectly clear that the reason Charlemagne was being nice and reaching out to Harun al-Rashid was almost like he was bribing him to be good to the Christians under his authority in Egypt, in Iraq, in the Islamic world, because there were so many Christians. So he says that, the chronicler, he says the reason he sought out friendships was so he can make the plight of Christians living in those regions less, and he can help them. Okay, so you see how, again, that is omitted, but we're told about, look, they got along, because Muslims and Christians always get along. So that's I can leave it at that with Charlemagne.
So then let's go to the Crusades.
Yeah.
This is quite a whistle blow tour.
Yeah.